Today we are going to finally dive into the first chapter of the book, The Human Condition. Before that, any questions or comments for what we have read so far? The preface, the foreword, the general introduction. If not, let's dive in this chapter. Are you all excited? Finally get to read the actual content of the book. Okay. Every chapter will begin with introduction. So let's read. Give me a second. Okay. Like other religious teachings, the Buddha's teaching originates as a response to the strains at the heart of the human condition. What distinguishes his teaching from other religious approaches to the human condition is the directness, thoroughness, and uncompromising realism with which he looks at these strains. The Buddha does not offer us palliatives that leave the underlying maladies untouched beneath the surface. Rather, he traces our existential illness down to its most fundamental causes, so persistent and destructive, and shows us how this can be totally uprooted. However, while the Dharma will eventually lead to the wisdom that eradicates the causes of suffering, it does not begin there, but with observations about the hard facts of everyday experience. Here too is directness, thoroughness, and tough realism are evident. The teaching begins by calling upon us to develop a faculty called Yoniso Manasikara, careful attention. The Buddha asks us to stop drifting thoughtlessly through our lives and instead to pay careful attention to simple truths that are everywhere available to us, clamoring for the sustained consideration they deserve. Let's take a look at one of these words, palliatives. Of a treatment or medicine, relieving pain or alleviating a problem without dealing the underlying cause. If we go back to the sentence, in this context, the Buddha does not only offer us some kind of relieving pain without treating the underlying causes. Here he mentions the underlying maladies. Let's define maladies. A disease or ailment. So the Buddha does not offer us just a simple pain reliever without treating the underlying diseases or ailments. Instead, what the Buddha did, he traces our existential illness down to its most fundamental causes, down to its roots. So persistent and destructive and also shows us how this can be totally uprooted. The Dharma will eventually lead to wisdom that eradicates these fundamental causes of suffering. But it does not begin that way. It begins with the observations of the hard facts of everyday experience. Okay, that's for this paragraph. The next paragraph, Sister Xinghui, would you like to read?
One of the most obvious and inescapable of these truths is also amongst the most difficult for us to fully acknowledge, namely, that we are bound to grow old, fall ill, and die. It is commonly assumed that the Buddha beckons us to recognize the reality of old age and death in order to motivate us to enter the path of renunciation leading to Nibbana, complete liberation from the realm of birth and death. However, while this may be his ultimate intention, it is not the first response he seeks to evoke in us when we return to him for guidance. The initial response the Buddha intends to arouse in us is an ethical one. By calling our attention to our bondage to the old and death, he seeks to inspire in us a firm resolution to turn away from unwholesome ways of finding and to embrace instead wholesome alternatives.
Thanks, Sister Xinghui. This is, of course, one of the truths that we can observe. That we, all of us, are bound to grow old, fall ill, and die. It is commonly assumed that the Buddha beckons. Let's take a look at these words. Beckon, make a gesture with the hand, arm, or head to encourage someone to come nearer or follow. The third definition would be more appropriate. Seem to be appealing or inviting us. To recognize the reality of this old age and death, and then move us to enter the path of renunciation. Here, Bhikkhu Bodhi says, this may be his ultimate intention, but this is not the first response the Buddha seeks to evoke in us, when we turn to him for his teachings. So what is the first response? What is the initial response that the Buddha intends to arouse? It is the ethical one. Let me highlight this. By calling our attention to old age and death, he seeks to inspire us. A firm resolution to turn away from unwholesome ways of living and to embrace instead wholesome alternatives, to live in wholesome ways. That's the second paragraph, recognizing the truth and then evoking an ethical responses, living in a wholesome way. Next paragraph, Sister Jolene, would you like to read?
Morning, brother and everyone. Again, the Buddha grounds its initial ethical appeal not only upon a compassionate feeling for other beings, but also upon our instinctive concern for our own long-term welfare and happiness. He tries to make us see that to act in accordance with the ethical guidelines will enable us to secure our own well-being, both now and in the long-term future. His argument hinges on the important premise that actions have consequences. If we are to alter our accustomed ways, we must be convinced of the validity of this principle, specifically to change from a self-stultifying way of life to one that is truly fruitful and inwardly rewarding. We must realize that our actions have consequences for ourselves, consequences that can rebound upon us both in this life and in subsequent lives.
Thanks,
brother.
Really.
Thank you, brother.
Let's take a look at this word, stultifying. stultify, stultify, stultify or stultify. Cause to lose enthusiasm and initiative, especially as a result of a tedious or restrictive routine. Second definition, cause someone to appear foolish or absurd. Okay, give me a second, let me check the pronunciation of this. Stultify. Yeah, it's to be stultify. So self-stultifying, cause self to appear foolish or absurd in these lines. Okay, so his argument hinges on the important premise that actions have consequences, basically the law of karma. So this paragraph emphasizes on realization that we have to realize that our actions have consequences for ourselves. Consequences that can rebound upon us both in this life and also subsequent lives. Highlight this. Any more difficult words here? Okay, if not, next paragraph. Sister Choi Kwan, would you like to read?
The three suttas that constitute the first section of this chapter establish this point eloquently, each in its own way. Text 1, text I-11, enunciates the inevitable law that all beings who have taken birth must undergo aging and death. Although at first glance the discourse seems to be stating a mere fact of nature, by citing one as examples, members of the upper strata of society, wealthy rulers, Brahmins and householders, and liberated arahants, it insinuates a subtle moral message into its words. Text I-12 brings out this message more explicitly with its impressive simile of the mountain, which drives home the point that when aging and death are rolling in on us, our task in life is to live righteously and do wholesome and meritorious deeds. The Sutta on the Divine Messengers, text I-13, establishes the corollary to this. When we fail to recognize the divine messengers in our midst, when we miss the hidden warning signals of old age, illness, and death, we become negligent and behave recklessly, creating unwholesome karma with the potential to yield dreadful consequences. Thank you.
Thanks, Sister Choi Kwan. This paragraph starts to talk about the actual suttas itself, which we will read in the subsequent days or weeks. The text I-12 is one of my favorite sutta in this book as well, with the simile of the mountain. We will read those later on. Any difficult words here? Corollary maybe. Corollary, a proposition that follows from and is often appended to one already proved. A direct or natural consequence or result. Another word would be associated, supplementary. So the text I-13 establishes the supplementary to this. If we fail to recognize the divine messengers, then we will become negligent and behave recklessly, creating unwholesome karma with potential to yield dreadful consequences. Next paragraph is the Psychiatric. Would you like to read?
Thank you. The realization that we are bound to grow old and die breaks the spell of infatuation cast over us by sensual pleasures, wealth, and power. It dispels the mist of confusion and motivates us to take fresh stock of our purposes in life. We may not be ready to give up family and possessions for a life of homeless wandering and solitary meditation, but this is not an option the Buddha generally expects of his householder disciples. Rather, as we saw above, the first lesson he draws from the fact that our lives end in old age and death is an ethical one, interwoven with the twin principles of karma and rebirth. The law of karma stipulates that our unwholesome and wholesome actions have consequences extending far beyond this present life. Unwholesome actions lead to rebirth in states of misery and bring future pain and suffering. Wholesome actions lead to a pleasant rebirth and bring future well-being and happiness. Since we have to grow old and die, we should be constantly aware that any present prosperity we might enjoy is merely temporary. We can enjoy it only as long as we are young and healthy, and when we die, our newly acquired karma will gain the opportunity to ripen and bring forth its own results. We must then reap the due fruits of our deeds. With an eye to our long-term future welfare, we should scrupulously avoid evil deeds that result in suffering and diligently engage in wholesome deeds that generate happiness here and in future lives.
Thanks, Sister Saiken, for reading this long paragraph. Okay. Then this sentence is worth to highlight. The realization that we are bound to grow old and die breaks the spell of infatuation cast over us by sensual pleasures, wealth, power. How so? It's coming to this sentence. Since we have to grow old and die, whatever these things that infatuates us, sensual pleasures, wealth, and power, we become more aware that this present prosperity we enjoy is merely temporary. It further says, here we can enjoy it as long as we are young and healthy. And when we die, our newly acquired karma will gain the opportunity to ripen and bring forth its own results. Then we must reap the due fruits of our deeds. So to summarize quickly, what we have read so far starts with the observation of that everyone will grow old, will fall sick, will die. So by observing that fact, the Buddha invites us to live in a different way. In what way? From what way to what way? From an unwholesome way of living to a wholesome way of living. Why? Because the Buddha asks us to recognize there is this principle of twin principles of karma and rebirth, that our actions have consequences. if we continue to live in an unwholesome way, then we will reap. There's a potential to yield bad consequences. Okay, any questions or comments? I think this is a good time to stop. If not, let's do a dedication. 愿消三障诸烦恼，愿得智慧真明了，普愿罪障悉消除，世世常行菩萨道。阿弥陀佛。